Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers.
Season 3, Episode 10, the one about the 10 Commandments. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. In this week's episode, I want to delve deep into the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are arguably some of the most famous laws in history, but where do they come from? What do they mean? Are they still relevant in the 21st century? Now, I wonder how many of them you can remember off by heart. I mean, I'm guessing most of you know 2 or 3, but pause this episode, count how many you can remember. So, how many was it? I bet you got the do not kill one, the do not lie one, and the do not steal. Maybe even the do not commit adultery and honour your parents. But what about the one that says do not worship idols or do not covet what your neighbour has? I also wonder how many of you used the word thy as you tried to remember them. Strange, isn't it? The word thy hasn't been used in the English language for about 500 years. But for some reason we feel the need to use it when quoting the 10 Commandments, as though somehow God is a 17th century Lord and he won't understand it if we use modern language. But of course, the Bible wasn't written in English. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and that leads us nicely on to where the 10 Commandments came from. Right, first things first, the Bible is not a book. I repeat, the Bible is not a book. It's a library of books. Biblios means books. If you speak German or French, you'll know that bibliothèque is their word for library. The Bible is in 2 parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Testament means account. It's where we get our word testimony from. The Old Testament is from the creation of the world up until a few hundred years before Jesus. The New Testament starts with the birth of Jesus and goes all the way until the end of the world. Now remember I said the Bible wasn't a book, it was a library. Well, in this library there are 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. The Bible opens with the book of Genesis, a word that means beginning, which is apt as the book of Genesis explains the beginning or creation of the world. As we already know, it was perfect. God created humans and then humans sinned. We got punished, a bit of painful childbirth there, some hard work, enemy with nature, different languages confusing us all, but ultimately sin had entered the world. Eventually things got so bad that God had to destroy the world with one big flood, what Eddie Izzard calls the Etch-a-Sketch end of the world, except for one family, Noah, his wife and their sons. Now I don't want to get sidetracked, but most religions have some sort of flood story. It's almost as if there might have been one in our history. You know, when the ice from the Ice Age melted or something. But that's a whole different episode. But people continue to disobey God. A few hundred years later, a man called Abraham was born. Now, Abraham is known as the first monotheist, the first person to believe in one God. And this God speaks to Abraham. God makes a promise or covenant with Abraham. A covenant is a promise between God and humans. And this covenant promised that Abraham would have many descendants and these descendants would turn into a great nation. And then God would give them a great land. This special covenant passes on from Abraham to his son Isaac and then to his son Jacob, Abraham's grandson. Together, they represent the patriarchs or fathers of the Israelite people. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, and they all moved to Egypt after the youngest brother, Joseph, miraculously becomes a high official in Egypt. You've all seen Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? I close my eyes, drew back the curtains. Whoa. Hang on a second. Did they have curtains back then? Anyway, Jacob changed his name to Israel, so his 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel, the Israelites. Ta-da! In the book of Exodus, the second book in the Bible, the descendants of Jacob, now known as Israel's children, have become a vast people. But the Pharaoh of Egypt holds them in slavery. This is a different Pharaoh that made Joseph all high and mighty. This one not quite so nice. Now, You might have heard of a man called Moses if you've watched Prince of Egypt. There's no hard evidence that he actually existed as an historical person, but the events I'm about to recall have some basis in the events of the 13th century BCE. So God chooses this one man, Moses, to rescue the Israelites from slavery. The Pharaoh was not best pleased with this idea. Understandably, he did not want to give up his slaves because they did all his work for them. How do you think the pyramids got there? So Moses had to convince him. With the help of God, 10 plagues are sent to Egypt. Water into blood, frogs, lice, flies, sick cattle, boils, fire and hail, locusts, really rubbish things. But it was the final plague, the death of the firstborn, plus a few magic tricks, that finally convinced Pharaoh to let the slaves go. Partly because he's now lost his own firstborn son, his heir, and in his grief, in that weak moment, he lets the Israelites go. So Moses leads the Israelite slaves out of Egypt across the Reed Sea. Yes, that was not a mistake. It is the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea. Red Sea, very difficult to cross without boats. Reed Sea, a sort of marshland that's kind of much easier to cross. And they end up in the sort of area of Mount Sinai. So this is where it becomes relevant to this episode. We've essentially now got thousands of ex-slaves wandering the desert for years with no plan, little food and water, and they understandably start to get a bit angsty. They even start pining after the slave life they had left, as at least there they had a purpose and regular food. So the first thing God provided was some food and water. It says that manna fell from heaven, so this sort of food fell from heaven, and miraculously water sprung up from the desert. Once they've been fed and watered, God takes Moses up a mountain to give him some guidelines. These guidelines become the 10 Commandments, and these have formed the basis of our law since. Before we dive into them, I have to say that one of my favourite parts of the Bible is in this story. When Moses went up the mountain to listen to God, you have to remember, it's not like he had a pen and paper or anything, so all the rules God gave him, he had to carve into stone. Now, don't know if you've ever tried carving into stone. Not easy. It took him a long time. In fact, he was up the mountain for so long that the freed slaves down below thought he died. So they melted down all of their gold, made a statue of a cow, and started worshipping it. When Moses came down the mountain and saw this, he got the rage, and he smashed the stone tablets on the floor. Not kidding. So he had to go back up the mountain and ask God for them again. Just can picture the scene. God, excuse me, but sorry to bother you, but you know those really important rules you just gave me? What were they again? I seem to have lost them. As Moses surreptitiously tries to brush the broken tablets away with his foot. Anyway, after etching them back into stone again, he then relayed them to the Israelites. Let's first just check out the title, the 10 Commandments. In the original Hebrew, it is Azaret Hadibrot. Excuse my pronunciation, I'm not very good at Hebrew, but they basically could translate as the 10 words, the 10 sayings, or the 10 matters. The word commandment wasn't actually used until the 16th century. Also, there are actually 14, but some of them have been combined. They form part of the 613 commandments or mitzvot set out in the Torah, but these are the ones that are timeless and universal. It starts by God introducing himself as Yahweh. This was the personal name for God that Moses uses. Later on, they referred to God as Elohim, a more universal name for God, and was also used for other gods around at the time. It continues by reminding Moses that this is the God that had brought them out of slavery, just in case he'd forgotten. Now, the first commandment is not to have any other gods before Yahweh. Now, this is interesting. It does not claim that there is only one God. It actually assumes there are other gods, but that you have to put this one first. And there were other gods at the time, as I mentioned before. I mean, the Egyptians are known to have had at least 10. You've probably heard of Ra, the sun god, which is part of the word Pharaoh. Helps you remember how to spell it. I am going to introduce a word here. Bear with me. The word is henotheism. Henotheism means that you believe in one particular god out of several possibilities. Particularly if you belong to a family or tribe or other group, you would have your particular god that you would choose. Technically then, The Israelites were henotheists rather than monotheists. Monotheists claim there is only one God. Henotheists choose to worship one God. The first commandment says you can't make images of God or worship any other gods. This would have been an important commandment for the Israelites because they'd been surrounded by the Egyptian religion and culture. However, it's an interesting commandment for people in the 21st century because we all have gods, whether it is money, power, gaming, exercise, our friends, phones, food, whatever it is that you put first in your life, that is your God. It's whatever brings your life meaning or purpose, whatever you put most effort into, whatever you get the most joy from. So this has universal application. I think it is right to consider critically what your God is and whether it is deserving of that position and whether it does you more good than harm. I personally think anyone who puts money first in their life is going to find it much harder to make morally right decisions. However, I think this commandment brings with it so many problems, mainly because it's misunderstood by people. People mistakenly think it states that there is only one God. As I said before, it doesn't. This misunderstanding has led to dogmatic monotheism. And I think that some people also have a problem with a God that commands you to worship him. We live in a pluralist world. What I mean by that is that there is more than one belief option. Plural options. You can choose to believe in God, or not to be sure, or to worship more than one. So to be commanded to only worship one does get our tolerant backs up. But let's consider this for a moment. What would happen if everyone worshipped the same God? I mean, it would make the world a little more peaceful, right? Except that it wouldn't, would it? Catholics and Protestants worship the same God, but they have a tricky relationship. Sunni and Shias worship the same one God and still have the odd tiff. And I can't help bringing to mind the Crusades where, excuse my reductive summary, Muslims were given the choice of worshipping the God of the Old Testament or dying. Now that's a pretty horrific choice. Imagine if your choice was marrying someone you didn't like or dying. Now I know that some people think that if you worship the wrong God, it will have eternal consequences. So I understand people's passion in instilling this rule to us, but I'm still not sure it's the best commandment to bring us into the 21st century. The second commandment says that they are not allowed to take the Lord's name in vain. I think this is another one which is slightly misunderstood. As a child, I was told that saying things like, "Oh my God," was breaking the second commandment. It was called blasphemy. It was also believed that it meant stating that God didn't exist or questioning God. Throughout the Bible, there are people who do question God or get angry with him. If we have a look at the original Hebrew, the meaning is much more specific than this. It is about using God's name for falsehood. Let's look at an example of this. When George Bush Jr. was President of the United States, he claimed that God told him to go to war with Iraq. Now, if the Bible says, "do not kill," then it is probably unlikely that God told Bush to go and kill loads of people. What about priests who use their position in the church to abuse children? Or preachers who get people to donate their hard-earned money to them so they can buy private jets? Or people that say that God hates fags? To me, this is what the second commandment means. Don't use God's name to give authority to things that are false. And I'm totally with this one. The third commandment says to remember one day per week and keep it holy. This has been interpreted in many different ways, like you can't turn lights on, you can't watch TV, you have to worship God all day. All these things are valid, but let's consider a more universal meaning. What impact would it have on our mental, emotional and physical health if we all had one complete day off every week? All the way through my GCSEs, A-levels, degree and teaching career, I've always had one complete day off. On this day, I see friends or go for a walk or watch movies or cook cakes. I totally recommend this. Work-life balance, people. The second part of this verse, I think, is trying to be a little humorous. It mentions that even God had a day of rest after creating the world. I mean, even God, in his power and majesty, had to put his feet up and have a brew after all that creating. But let's take this one step further. The verse suggests to keep the day holy. What if this means that you should focus on the divine? Focus on something greater than yourself. Maybe this is worship in a church or meditation or charity work or self-love. It means don't work. Don't be selfish. Do something for the greater good. What a better world it would be if we did this. So yes, I am totally with this one too. Okay, so honouring your mother and your father. I find this a tricky one for many reasons. If your parents are abusive, then I'm not sure what it means to honour them. Or if your parents are racist or homophobic or bigots, then do we have to honour them? I'm reminded of the only story in the Bible about Jesus and his parents, and he ran off for 3 days and they lost him. Man, that must have been the worst 3 days of their life. Jesus also said that he had come to set children against their parents. So I'm slightly confused. In my research, I read an interesting article about this commandment, which I will put a link to in the show notes. The original Hebrew word kabed, translated as honour, has many meanings, including to be heavy or to give weight to or to seriously consider a relationship. It does not suggest being subordinate or obedient to parents who harm us. It suggests in the second half of the verse that we will live a better life if we do this. So what could it mean to honour a relationship? To be honest, to forgive, to set boundaries, to respect boundaries, to communicate, to weigh up the best way to manage that relationship effectively. But be thankful for the things they did right.
In the Injil Sharif, Hazrat Isa al-Masih taught, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see Allah." Many religious people are obsessed with outward purity, but Allah Ta'ala is concerned about the purity of our hearts. According to this ayat, we can only draw close to the Almighty if our hearts are pure. Come learn how Allah Ta'ala wants to purify your heart on the Injil from Lessons podcast.
This feels like a healthy way to honour your parents regardless of what they are like. You will not murder. I think most of us instinctively agree with this one without question. I think that is naive. I teach a lesson which starts with the phrase, "It's okay to kill." I watch the children come in and they question this. So I explain to them, look at all the situations where this statement is perfectly acceptable. Abortion, euthanasia, war, capital punishment. The children reluctantly agree. But then they say, but it's wrong to murder. And I ask them why. Well, they say it's against the law. I mentioned that at times homosexuality was against the law, and slavery and racism were perfectly legal. So the law is not a great reason to accept or reject a behaviour. They then say that we wouldn't like it if we were murdered, so we shouldn't do it to others. I point out the flaws in this, which is 1. There are lots of things I wouldn't like people to do to me, like tickling me, but that doesn't make it wrong. I also point out that they would have no problem murdering Hitler or a paedophile, or defending someone they love, or getting revenge. They say at this point that it's not right to kill innocent people. I point out that innocent people don't really exist. Everyone has done something wrong to somebody. They suggest that murder causes pain and we shouldn't cause pain to people. I mention injections or homework which cause pain but aren't wrong. At this point, the children start to get restless. I do put them out of their misery in the end. Murder is wrong because it simply can't be right. If it was right, then anyone could kill anyone for any reason. So if it can't be right, it has to be wrong. And this is the point, isn't it? We could probably all find justifiable reasons to kill someone, but that doesn't make it right. It has to be wrong because the alternative would end the human race. When it comes down to it, we are animals who are trying to protect ourselves and the survival of the human race. Murder is the opposite of survival. If we base our society on this principle, do not murder, then the world is a much better place where we get to survive. You will not commit adultery. Seriously, people, just don't. Nobody wins, there are no gains. It may be understandable, that doesn't make it right. I literally cannot think of a single reason to justify a belief that you should commit adultery. If I am missing something glaringly obvious, please tweet me at the RE Podcast 1. There are so many other options available to you. Stay single, separate, have an open relationship, get counselling, don't drink alcohol. but don't commit adultery, people. You will not steal. I mean, duh. But hang on. What about the Robin Hood predicament? Should you steal from the rich to feed the poor? Well, yes, but there are ways of doing this that doesn't involve stealing. What about buying fair trade instead of free trade products? What about paying your fair share of tax, not mentioning any names? Or closing tax loopholes so everybody has to pay their fair amount of tax? What about buying from independent stores rather than large international companies, not mentioning any names? We live in a world where the taxpayer paid £500 billion to bail out banks after a global economic crisis. And what caused this crisis? A culture of banks committing illegal fraud for personal financial gain. And do you know how many of these criminals went to prison? How many of these people committing fraud? None of them. Not a single one. In a complicated setup with hedge funds and submortgages, lots of rich people became illegally much richer at the expense of the poor. And when it all went wrong, we bailed them out. Do you know who did go to prison? The people who rioted because of this. Ask Jeff Bezos how much tax he pays, and then think about this commandment. Also, I think there are other things that we can steal, like people's time, people's happiness, people's self-esteem, natural resources. I think this is probably one of the most interesting commandments of the 10 and deserves some thought. Okay, the next one. You will not bear false witness against anyone. This is not as simple as do not lie. There are stories in the Bible where people lie. I mean, read the story of Rahab. Throughout Nazi occupation, many Jewish lives were saved because people lied, Anne Frank being the most well-known example. But it is sometimes hard to know when it is okay to lie. Our tendency is to lie to protect ourselves, particularly from getting in trouble. But we are so judgmental about others doing it. You know, when governments lie about other countries having weapons of mass destruction, or politicians lying about having affairs. It is difficult to know when it is morally justifiable to lie. But actually, this commandment is about bearing false witness, i.e. accusing someone of something they haven't done, or not being truthful about someone's character. I don't mind admitting that one of the things I find the hardest to deal with is if people give false truths to others about me. So this is not as simple as do not lie as a general statement. When organising a surprise party, one has to lie. I guess we have to look at the motivation and the consequences. If you are lying to stop justice happening, then it is not okay. If you are lying to ensure justice happens, then maybe it is okay. If you are lying to protect yourself, then it is not okay. If you are lying to give someone a wonderful surprise, then knock yourself out. So we come to the last one. This is considered, in the words of Stephen Fry, link in the show notes, one of the silly ones. But I don't agree. It is basically a list of things you shouldn't crave. Now, if you listen to my episode on Buddhism about the middle way, you may remember that they also point out the problem with craving. Craving leads to suffering. I don't know about you, but do you compare yourself to others and come off worse for it? I wish I had hair like them and a body like them. Their style, their house, their eyes, their personality. If you want what other people have, then it means that you are not content with what you have. And if you are not content with what you have, then you are not content. The secret to happiness is being content with what you have and who you are. I have a painting in my house, painted by a dear friend, that reminds me that I am enough. It's transformed my mental health. So what things does the Bible suggest we shouldn't crave? People's houses, people's partners, people's servants, people's mode of transport, or anything that belongs to anyone else. We live in a world of show-offs. Just look at social media, photoshopped pictures, happy family and relationship pictures, perfect holidays and days out, ideal homes. It's not real people. Accept who you are, be content with what you have. So it seems as though, on the whole, these are not too bad as a set of commandments. However, we have to consider what they don't mention. This is something else that Stephen Fry mentions. There's a link to his debate on this in the show notes. I really recommend watching it. I can think of probably 5 things that don't seem to have made the top 10, and it is surprising to me that they haven't. Rape, child abuse, violence, discrimination, and slavery. And the Israelites kept slaves, as have Christians throughout history, even right now as you listen to this. I think that if we needed a top 10, then these should make it. And I would probably move some of the ones we've discussed down a few. What I think is interesting is that Jesus was actually questioned on these commandments. He was actually asked which one was the most important, I think in a bid to try and catch him out. He summarized them into 2 commandments. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And this is where I want to end this episode. What is more beautiful than loving something greater than yourself? Loving yourself and loving others. Before I go, I will just give a shout out to Frances Jeans, who contacted me on Twitter to give me something interesting to say on this podcast about the 10 commandments. And she says this, how about this one? Commandments 1 to 4 are about human relationships to God. Commandments 6 to 10 are about people's relation to humanity. The 5th commandment, that of honouring one's parents, is often seen as a bridge between the 2. Very interesting. Also, Jane Chipperton-Smits also contacted me on Twitter with a link to 42 ancient Egyptian laws that might have inspired the 10 commandments. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. I would love to know your thoughts, so please email me, louisajanesmith@therepodcast.co.uk, or follow me on Twitter @therepodcast1 and DM me your thoughts on the podcast, on this episode, on anything you like, really. Do you agree with what I've said? Is there anything else you think the 10 commandments have missed out? Did you learn anything? Did I get anything wrong? As always, I would love to hear from you. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE Podcast. The podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. I just proved it to you. But thank you so much for listening to me bore the life out of you.